Hello ladies and gents, welcome to Calm Stories. In this video, we quietly unfold some of the darkest and most fascinating events in history. Every story you hear is real, based on true events and the lives of real people. These are not fiction. These things happened. Let us know in the comments which story stayed with you the most. We read every word. Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie Parker was bored with her life and wanted something more exciting. Her life changed when she met a young drifter named Clyde Barrow. Both were struggling financially, which may have pushed them into a life of crime. The thrill and excitement of robbing places also influenced their choices. Their crimes happened during the Great Depression. Bonnie and Clyde had very different upbringings. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1st, 1910, in Rowena, Texas. She had one older brother and one younger sister. When she was 4, her father died, so her mother moved the family to live with Bonnie's grandmother in Cement City. Bonnie was a smart student who loved poetry and reading. As a child, she dreamed of becoming an actress. There were no signs she would turn to crime. During her second year of high school, Bonnie started dating a boy named Roy Thornton. Just before her 16th birthday, they got married in September 1926. But Roy became abusive, and the marriage quickly fell apart. They never got divorced, and Roy ended up in jail for several robberies. Bonnie moved back in with her grandmother and never saw him again. Clyde Champion Barrow was born on March 24, 1909, in Tellico, Texas. He had 7 siblings. His parents were tenant farmers and didn't earn enough money. When Clyde was 12, his family moved to West Dallas, where his father got a job at a gas station. Clyde lived in a tough neighborhood, but did okay. He and his brother Buck often got in trouble for stealing from stores and gas stations. Clyde had 2 serious girlfriends before meeting Bonnie, but never married. Knight says Bonnie and Clyde met in January 1930 at a friend's house and clicked instantly. Bonnie was very smart, and no one knows exactly why she became a criminal. A prison psychiatrist, Norberto Rodriguez, suggested it may have been because she didn't want to lose Clyde. Shortly after meeting Bonnie, Clyde was sentenced to 2 years in prison for robbery. He first stayed in a local jail and was then moved to Eastham Farm Prison. There, he met a man named Fultz, who warned him that life on the farm was harsh. At Eastham, prisoners were forced to work long hours and were beaten if they didn't do a good job. One punishment involved standing handcuffed on a vinegar barrel for hours. Prisoners only received letters from family, so Clyde listed Bonnie as his wife so she could write to him. Other inmates called her his little blue-eyed girl. During his time at Eastham, Clyde was sexually assaulted by another prisoner. He eventually killed the man with a lead pipe. Another inmate serving a life sentence took the blame. Later, Clyde was moved to another section of the farm, where prisoners were forced to beat other inmates. Clyde's mother worked hard to get his sentence reduced, claiming she needed her son's help. Governor Sterling signed the papers to shorten his sentence on January 27th. Before being released, Clyde asked another inmate to cut off 2 of his toes so he could avoid the hard labor. This was common. Many prisoners injured themselves to avoid working. Clyde was released on February 2nd, 1934, and reunited with Bonnie. Bonnie's mother begged Clyde to stop committing crimes and get a job. He tried working, but didn't like it. Soon, he started robbing small stores again with a group of men. Clyde's crimes included robbery, car theft, kidnapping, and murder. He began his criminal activities at 21 and is believed to have seen crime as exciting and fun. One night, the gang planned to rob a gas station. Clyde stayed in the car because he knew the owner. Gunshots rang out, and one of his men killed the owner. Although Clyde didn't shoot him, he was still blamed and became wanted for murder. By the end of the year, he was also wanted for killing a sheriff and other policemen. Bonnie joined Clyde and his gang around this time. Bonnie had few opportunities growing up and deeply loved Clyde. She was soon arrested and spent time in jail, where she wrote poetry and stories about their life. After her release, another man, W.D. Jones, joined the gang but left after a few months. Later, Clyde's brother Buck and his wife Blanche joined, and the group became known as the Barrow Gang. Blanche was eventually caught and jailed. She wrote about Bonnie and Clyde's relationship during her time behind bars. After her release, the gang began robbing banks across several states. Clyde was the leader and drove most of the time, about 300 miles a day, to avoid being caught. They traveled through South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and finally Louisiana. The police worked hard to find them, and even local people wanted them caught. In summer 1933, a group of people spotted them and started shooting. Blanche wrote that she remembered Clyde yelling, "Look out," as gunfire broke out. Buck was badly hurt and died days later. Blanche was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison. After that, only Bonnie and Clyde were left. Clyde hated prison, especially Eastham Farm. He once said he'd rather die than go back. He and Bonnie made a plan to raid the prison. In January, they drove to Eastham. While Bonnie waited in the car, Clyde broke in and helped 5 prisoners escape, killing 3 guards in the process. With no turning back, Bonnie and Clyde kept running. On Easter Sunday, 2 policemen unknowingly approached them while they were parked in a field. Clyde shot and killed them. After this, they became even more hated, and everyone wanted them captured. A man named Frank Hamer was hired to track them down. He followed their movements closely and even tapped their families' phones. Eventually, in Bienville, Louisiana, Hamer and 5 other officers waited in ambush. As Bonnie and Clyde approached in a stolen car, the officers opened fire. In a letter, Blanche wrote that she was glad they died together, so neither had to live without the other. Their tough childhoods, poverty, and lack of opportunity may have led them to crime. Or maybe it was the idea that a criminal life would set them free from the struggles of the Depression. Either way, Bonnie and Clyde remain 2 of America's most famous criminals. Ma Barker and her boys. It was early morning on January 16, 1935, in a quiet Florida town. A large group of agents from the Bureau of Investigation, soon to be called the FBI, surrounded a small house by a lake. Inside, members of one of the most dangerous criminal gangs in U.S. history were hiding. After 5 years of crimes across the Midwest, it was time for a final face-off with the law. The officers called out to the gang, telling them they were surrounded and needed to surrender. There was silence. Then, Agent Early Connolly from Cincinnati shouted, "Come out, or we're going to start shooting." A woman's voice replied boldly, "All right, go ahead." A rough beginning. Arizona Donnie Clark, later known as Ma Barker, was born on October 8, 1873, in Ash Grove, Missouri. Her family came from Scottish and Irish roots. People usually called her Ari, but later she started going by Kate. On September 4th, 1892, she married George Barker, and they lived in Aurora, Missouri. George wasn't very hard-working. He worked as a sharecropper and took low-paying jobs. They had 4 sons: Herman, born 1894, Lloyd, 1896, Arthur, 1899, and Fred, 1902. Around 1904, the family moved to Webb City, Missouri, and later to Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1915. According to the FBI, the Barkers were poor and didn't try much to improve their situation. The boys didn't get much education and were almost illiterate. Ma Barker let her boys do as they pleased and ignored complaints from neighbors about their behavior. She once said, "If the good people of this town don't like my boys, then the good people know what they can do." The boys started getting in trouble with the law at a young age. Herman was arrested for robbery in 1910 at age 16. He was arrested again in 1915 in Joplin, Missouri, for robbing with a group called the Central Park Gang. Arthur was arrested in 1918 for stealing a car and escaped from police custody. In the 1920s, the Barker boys' crimes became more serious. All 4 were involved in bank robberies and shootouts, some of which ended in the deaths of police officers. They were arrested, released, and kept committing more crimes. Lloyd Barker was sentenced to 25 years in prison in 1922 for robbing mail in Kansas. He served his time at Leavenworth Prison and stayed out of trouble after his release in 1938. He worked as a cook in the US Army and later helped run a restaurant in Colorado. Sadly, he was shot and killed by his wife less than 2 months after marrying her in 1949. She was sent to a mental hospital. Arthur "Doc" Barker went to jail in 1921 for trying to rob a bank. A month after being released, he was caught breaking into a warehouse with his friend Volney Davis. During the robbery, a night watchman was killed. Arthur was sentenced to life in prison. Fred Barker robbed a bank in 1926 and was sent to prison in Kansas in 1927. Herman Barker tried to cash stolen bonds later that year. When a sheriff tried to stop him, Herman shot him. He was also involved in the killing of a Wichita police officer. A few weeks later, Herman was killed in a police shootout after robbing a factory. After Herman died and the others were in jail, George Barker left the family in 1928 and ran a gas station in Joplin. Some said Ma kicked him out. Others said he couldn't live with his family's criminal lifestyle. The FBI claimed he enjoyed the money from his son's crimes, but there's no real proof of that. Most say he stayed out of their business. Now, Ma Barker was left to take care of her remaining sons. She began visiting prison officials, parole boards, and governors, begging them to release her boys. When asking nicely didn't work, she would cause such a scene that officials gave in just to get rid of her. Eventually, Arthur and Fred were released thanks to her efforts. Ma Barker made freeing her sons her full-time job. She kept pleading with authorities as her sons continued to go in and out of prison. The Barker Carpis Gang. Fred's time in prison wasn't a lesson. It was a turning point in his life of crime. There, he met Alvin "Creepy" Carpis, a criminal with a creepy smile. They became partners, and along with Fred's brothers and other gangsters, formed a powerful criminal group. This gang committed bank robberies, murders, and kidnappings. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover later called them the most vicious, cold-blooded crew of murderers, kidnappers, and robbers in recent memory. The Kray Twins. Reggie Kray, full name Reginald Kray, was born on October 24, 1933, In Hoxton, London, he is one of the most infamous figures in British criminal history. Along with his identical twin brother, Ronnie Kray, the pair would go on to rule the East End of London during the 1950s and 1960s. Together, they created a legacy that mixed celebrity glamour with ruthless crime, becoming legends of the underworld. The Kray Twins ran a powerful gang known as the Firm, and their empire included armed robberies, illegal gambling, protection rackets, extortion, arson, and multiple murders. Despite their violent reputation, they also built a public image that made them celebrities. They were often seen at high-profile events, socializing with movie stars, musicians, and even politicians. But behind the sharp suits and camera flashes, the Krays lived a life of intimidation, control, and bloodshed. Their rise to power was not only the story of two brothers climbing to the top, it was also the story of how violence, charm, and fear worked together to keep them there. Growing up in London's East End, Reggie and Ronnie were born in 1933, just minutes apart, to parents Charles Kray, a wardrobe dealer, and Violet Kray, a deeply protective and loyal mother. The twins grew up in Bethnal Green, one of London's poorest areas. Their childhood was shaped by war, poverty, and a strong sense of family. During World War II, like many East End families, the Krays were forced to move to the countryside for safety due to German bombing raids. After the war, they returned to London still recovering from devastation. The Kray family home was filled with loyalty, discipline, and pride. Their mother, Violet, adored the twins and would go to any lengths to defend them. Their father, Charles, was often absent due to work, so Violet played the most important role in raising them. From a young age, Reggie and Ronnie showed signs that they were different. They were strong, confident, and unusually close to each other. Some said too close. The bond between them would later become one of the most dangerous aspects of their criminal lives. They seemed to feed off each other's energy, pushing one another further into violence and crime. A double nature, charm, and trouble. As boys, the Krays had a reputation in their neighborhood. On the surface, they were polite and well-dressed, but those who knew them closely noticed their aggressive side. They didn't like being told what to do and would often get into fights. People who met them at first often found them charming. They were good-looking, funny, and knew how to win people over. But underneath, both Reggie and Ronnie were drawn to the idea of being powerful, feared, and respected. By their teenage years, the twins had started fighting with other boys in the area and running small-time scams. They were expelled from school for bad behavior and joined the British Army in their late teens. But army life didn't suit them. They got into fights with officers, refused to follow orders, and were eventually dishonorably discharged. This rejection added to their dislike of authority and pushed them even further toward a life of crime. The first steps into crime. After leaving the army, Reggie and Ronnie began building their reputation on the streets. They started running protection rackets, where they would threaten business owners unless they paid money for security. If the shopkeepers refused, their windows would be smashed or they'd be beaten. At first, these operations were small, but the Krays were smart. They realized that fear could be a powerful tool. They began to act like businessmen, well-dressed, respectful on the surface, but made it clear they were not to be crossed. They also made sure to take care of people in their neighborhood. They gave money to struggling families, paid for local funerals, and helped people out when no one else would. This earned them a strange kind of respect in the East End. Some locals even looked up to them seeing them as modern-day Robin Hoods. But make no mistake, their generosity was tied to control. Helping people made them look good, but it also made others owe them favors. Everything they did had a purpose. As the Kray's influence grew, they began forming a proper gang. This group became known as the Firm, a mix of enforcers, hitmen, drivers, and lookouts. Many were childhood friends, while others were pulled in by fear or money. The Firm ran operations throughout London's East End, collecting protection money, running gambling dens, and controlling nightclubs. The Krays made sure every member of their crew was loyal, and if someone stepped out of line, the punishment was harsh. They were not afraid to use violence to keep their grip on power. Reggie was usually seen as the more controlled and business-minded of the two. Ronnie, on the other hand, was more unpredictable and known for his violent outbursts. Ronnie also struggled with mental health, especially schizophrenia, which would worsen over time. Despite their differences, the twins always stuck together. Their bond was unbreakable, and that made them even more dangerous. From crime to nightclubs and fame. In the late 1950s, the Kray Twins saw an opportunity to grow their empire. They began buying up nightclubs and gambling halls in central London. These clubs served two purposes. They made money, and they gave the Krays access to the upper class. Places like Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge weren't just party spots. They were the perfect front for illegal activities. Behind the scenes, deals were made, money was laundered, and criminal contacts were formed. But out in the open, the Krays were rubbing shoulders with actors, singers, models, and even members of parliament. They became regulars at high society events and were often photographed in the papers. They turned themselves into celebrities. Stars like Frank Sinatra, Diana Dawes, and Judy Garland were seen at their clubs. The media loved them, and many journalists were charmed by their smooth talk and sharp suits. Interviews with the Krays painted them as gentlemen gangsters, dangerous but stylish and smart. This image helped shield them from some of their crimes. People found it hard to believe that the well-dressed hosts of glamorous parties were also running a violent criminal empire. While their public image was charming, the truth was far more violent. The Krays used brutal enforcement tactics to maintain control. Anyone who challenged them, disrespected them, or broke loyalty was dealt with harshly. Their tactics included severe beatings, threats to families, and even murder. These acts were usually done personally or under their direct order. They wanted people to know that betrayal had consequences. Through fear, loyalty, and smart business moves, they turned the firm into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in London. Mental illness and instability. While Reggie usually stayed calm and focused, Ronnie was known for being unpredictable and dangerous. As he got older, his behavior became more erratic. He often acted on impulse, made wild threats, and could turn violent without warning. Ronnie was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a serious mental illness that caused him to hear voices and believe people were out to get him. At times, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital, but he managed to get out after convincing doctors he had recovered. In truth, his condition was never truly under control, and because of his role in the firm, nobody dared question him. His mental instability made him all the more terrifying, not only to outsiders, but to his own men. The murder of George Cornell. One of the most infamous crimes committed by the Krays happened in 1966. George Cornell was a known member of the Richardson gang, a rival group from South London. Tensions between the two gangs had been building for years. Cornell had once insulted Ronnie, calling him a fat poof during a fight between the gangs. Ronnie never forgot the insult. On March 9, 1966, Cornell was sitting at the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel, having a drink with a friend. Ronnie Kray, wearing a suit and long overcoat, entered the pub, walked up to Cornell, and shot him in the head with a 9mm Luger pistol. Witnesses froze in fear. Cornell died later in the hospital. Dozens of people had seen what happened, but no one was willing to testify. They were too afraid. Killing someone in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, showed how untouchable the Krays thought they were. This murder shocked the public, but it also gave the police a clear target. It would become one of the key crimes used to eventually bring the Krays down. Jack the Hat McVitie. A year later, another murder would push Reggie Kray over the edge and seal the fate of both brothers. Jack McVitie, known as Jack the Hat because he always wore one, was a low-level member of the firm. He'd once been close to the Krays, but had recently started causing problems. He was unreliable, drank too much, and had failed to carry out a hit for the twins. He also owed them money and had started talking back, which the Krays saw as a serious threat. Ronnie wanted him gone, and Reggie agreed. On the night of October 29, 1967, Jack was invited to a flat in Stoke Newington under false pretenses. He thought he was attending a party. Instead, he walked into a trap. Reggie confronted Jack, beat him, and then stabbed him to death in front of several witnesses. It was a messy, brutal killing, done up close and personal. Reggie later admitted that he regretted the way it happened, but by then, it was too late. The murder shocked even members of the firm. It wasn't just another gangland execution. It was sloppy, reckless, and it left behind witnesses. Fear kept those witnesses quiet for a while, but the cracks in the Krays' empire had begun to show. The murders of Cornell and McVitie weren't the only violent acts the Krays were involved in, but they were the most public, and they revealed a shift in the way the twins operated. In their earlier days, the Krays had used fear, but now they were using direct violence, often carried out personally. This made people inside their own gang uneasy. They began to wonder who might be next. Loyalty began to fade. Ronnie's behavior was becoming more unpredictable. He would go on long rants, threaten his own men, and behave as if he were invincible. Reggie, too, had changed. The man once known as the Calm Twin had now personally killed someone. The line between business and bloodlust had vanished. The Krays were no longer just feared, they were starting to look out of control. By late 1967, the Metropolitan Police had finally had enough. They had long suspected the Krays of major crimes, but getting evidence was difficult. Witnesses refused to talk, and the Krays were smart enough to cover their tracks, until now. After the McVitie murder, some members of the firm started talking to the police. They were scared, not just of prison, but of the Krays themselves. Being close to Reggie and Ronnie had once meant protection. Now, it felt like a death sentence. Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper Red was the man assigned to bring the Krays down. He'd been tracking them for years, but now he had a real chance. He set up a special task force to collect as much evidence as possible. The police began gathering statements from witnesses, wiretapping phones, and building a timeline of the twins' movements. They connected the Krays to extortion, violent assaults, and the murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie. On May 8, 1968, police moved in. In the early hours of the morning, they carried out simultaneous raids across London. Reggie and Ronnie were arrested at their home, along with other key members of the firm. This time, the police weren't letting go. In the weeks that followed, more and more people came forward. Some of their closest friends turned into informants. Others who had once stayed silent now saw a chance to break free. With so much pressure and so many testimonies, the case against the Krays became impossible to ignore. The Kray Twins were charged with multiple counts of murder, including those of Cornell and McVitie, and faced other charges such as extortion, robbery, and assault. As the Krays sat in prison awaiting trial, the image they had spent years building began to fall apart. Their reputation as gentlemen gangsters was replaced with the truth. Ruthless criminals who used fear, violence, and murder to hold on to power. The media, once fascinated by their charm, now printed the bloody reality of their crimes. Public opinion began to shift. The Krays weren't just tough guys anymore. They were killers. Reggie and Ronnie still believed they could beat the case. They thought their fame would protect them. But this time, they were wrong. Their trial would become one of the most famous in British history. But for now, the Krays had gone from untouchable to caged, waiting for justice to catch up with them. After their 1969 convictions, Reggie and Ronnie Kray spent the rest of their lives in prison. But outside the prison walls, their story continued to grow. The media, writers, filmmakers, and even the public remained fascinated with the Kray Twins, not just for their crimes, but for the strange blend of glamour and violence that defined them. As time passed, their story became more than just history. It became legend. The final years. Ronnie Kray remained in Broadmoor Hospital for the rest of his life due to his schizophrenia. He was monitored constantly and was heavily medicated. Even there, he continued to receive visitors and letters. Some people were fans, others were simply curious. Ronnie never expressed much regret. He continued to speak proudly about their time as gangsters. He died of a heart attack on March 17, 1995, at the age of 61. His funeral, held in East London, drew a large crowd of mourners, including old friends, fans, and family. It was one of the largest funerals London had seen in years for a convicted criminal. Reggie Kray remained in prison, moving between facilities over the years. He kept busy writing, giving interviews, and even speaking with journalists and film producers about his life. Unlike Ronnie, Reggie reflected deeply on his past. He expressed remorse, especially for the murder of Jack McVitie, which he admitted had haunted him for years. In 2000, Reggie was diagnosed with bladder cancer. As his condition worsened, public pressure grew to allow him to die outside prison. After serving over 30 years, he was finally released on compassionate grounds in August 2000. He died a few weeks later, on October 1st, 2000, at the age of 66. Like Ronnie's, Reggie's funeral attracted massive attention. Thousands lined the streets of East London, many of them people who still saw the Krays as local heroes. Almost immediately after their arrest in 1968, stories about the Krays started spreading. Over time, these stories blurred the line between fact and fiction. In books, films, and newspapers, the Krays were sometimes portrayed as ruthless monsters, and other times as misunderstood gentlemen, products of a hard life who chose crime because of the world they grew up in. In some versions, they were shown as protectors of the poor, men who gave back to their communities and only hurt those who deserved it. In others, they were violent thugs who used fear to control anyone in their path. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Myth versus reality. So who were the real Kray twins? The myth paints them as East End Robin Hoods, tough, loyal, and stylish men who cared about their people and punished only the wicked. The reality shows something darker. They used fear, threats, and violence to gain power. They committed cold-blooded murders. They hurt people who owed them money, challenged their authority, or simply crossed them at the wrong time. They built their empire by making others suffer. Yes, they loved their mother, and yes, they gave money to local families. But that didn't erase the brutality they were responsible for. Even Reggie himself admitted this in his final years. He said their story wasn't one to admire. It was a warning about what happens when power, violence, and pride go unchecked. Today, the Kray twins are remembered as symbols of a unique time in London's history, a time when the line between fame and fear was thin, when criminals could be celebrities, and when power came from both charm and cruelty. In the end, their story is one of lost potential. They could have run successful businesses, lived long lives outside of crime, but instead, they chose a path that led to prison, regret, and the loss of their freedom. For all the headlines, the fan mail, the interviews, and the films, the truth remains. Reggie and Ronnie Kray were not legends. They were criminals. They rose, ruled, and fell. And while their story continues to fascinate, it also serves as a reminder of the heavy cost of chasing power through fear. Final thoughts. The Kray twins left a lasting mark, not just on crime history, but on British culture. They were products of their environment, but also creators of their fate. They were sons, brothers, businessmen, and murderers. They were charming and terrifying. They inspired loyalty and fear. They were a contradiction. Their legacy is complex, and it should be. The Krays weren't just gangsters in sharp suits. They were a warning that even those who appear strong and untouchable can fall, and that the line between fame and infamy is sometimes only a few inches wide. H. Holmes, one of America's first serial killers. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as Dr. H. Holmes, is considered one of America's first known serial killers. He confessed to killing 27 people, though some believe the number may have been much higher, possibly over 100 victims. Most of these crimes were committed during the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, where millions of people had gathered from all over the country and the world. Holmes didn't just kill. He enjoyed tricking, torturing, and experimenting on his victims. He built a massive building later known as the Murder Castle, which was filled with secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, and hidden torture chambers. On the outside, it looked like a normal hotel. Inside, it was a deadly maze where many never made it out. The man behind the castle. Holmes was born Herman Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in a small town called Gilmanton, New Hampshire. His parents were very strict, religious Methodists. His mother was cold and distant, and his father was often drunk and abusive. Holmes was punished harshly, sometimes locked in the attic or denied food. His father reportedly even covered the children's mouths with kerosene-soaked rags to quiet them. Holmes was different from other kids. He was quiet, smart, and preferred to be alone. He was bullied in school for being strange. One time, other boys forced him into a doctor's office and shoved a human skeleton's hands into his face. Rather than being scared, Holmes became fascinated. That moment, he said later, started his obsession with death and anatomy. Early signs of darkness. Holmes spent much of his childhood in the woods near his home. There, he started dissecting animals, beginning with small reptiles and moving on to rabbits and dogs. He studied their bodies closely. This not only taught him how to handle flesh and bone, but also seemed to remove any sense of guilt or empathy. Some believe he may have committed his first murder at age 11. A boy named Tom, who was his friend, died after falling off a platform in an abandoned house. Holmes claimed it was an accident, but some think he pushed the boy and never admitted it. Later, Holmes studied medicine at the University of Michigan, where he continued his experiments. He even stole bodies from the school and used them to fake deaths for insurance fraud, a habit he would continue throughout his life. The creation of the murder castle. Holmes eventually moved to Chicago, where he built a massive hotel that would later become known as the Murder Castle. It was finished in 1892, just before the start of the 1893 World's Fair. The castle was cleverly designed to hide what Holmes was doing. He constantly fired and replaced workers so no one understood the full layout. The inside was like a horror maze. Narrow hallways that led nowhere, rooms with trapdoors, secret staircases, gas chambers, peepholes, and chutes that led directly to the basement. The basement was even worse. Holmes had a dissection table, a torture room, and a furnace disguised as an oil heater used to burn bodies. He also used acid pits and lime vats to strip flesh from bones. Some skeletons were cleaned and sold to medical schools. During the World's Fair, Holmes lured in victims by offering jobs and cheap lodging. Many of his victims were young women traveling alone to the city. Some came looking for work. Others checked into the castle and simply disappeared. Holmes killed them in many ways, gassing them in locked rooms, suffocating them in airtight chambers, or slowly torturing them. Afterward, he would dispose of the bodies in the basement. He was careful to hide all traces. Leaving Chicago, more crimes and betrayal. After the fair ended, Holmes left Chicago with a man named Benjamin Petezel, his trusted associate. Together, they traveled across the country, committing insurance scams and fraud. One plan involved faking Petezel's death, so his family could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy. Instead of faking it, Holmes decided it was easier to actually kill Petezel. Then, in a shocking move, he also murdered 3 of Petezel's 5 children, while lying to the mother and pretending the kids were safe. Holmes had made a deadly mistake. While in jail earlier, he had told another criminal, Marion Hedgepeth, about the insurance scam. After hearing that Holmes had double-crossed everyone and kept the money, Hedgepeth reported him to the police. The Pinkerton Detective Agency tracked Holmes down in Boston and arrested him in November 1894. At first, he was only charged with fraud, but when police started looking into his past, they discovered much, much more. The horrors revealed. When authorities searched the murder castle in Chicago, they were horrified. Behind the hotel's walls and under its floors were the remains of dozens of victims. Body parts, bones, and bloodstains were found everywhere. No one could say exactly how many people Holmes had killed, but some estimates claimed over 100. Holmes was now known across the country. Newspapers called him names like the Devil in the White City, the Monster of 63rd Street, and the Torture Doctor. His face appeared on front pages, and the public was both terrified and fascinated. Holmes confessed to 27 murders, but later told his lawyer he had killed 133 people. Many believed him. In 1895, he was put on trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel and his children. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. The execution of H. Holmes. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hanged at a prison in Philadelphia. Witnesses said he remained calm until the end. His death was slow, his neck didn't break, and it took over 15 minutes for him to die. Before his death, Holmes asked for his coffin to be filled with cement and buried extra deep to prevent anyone from stealing or cutting up his body after death. He, the man who dissected so many others, was afraid of being dissected himself. What made him this way? Some say Holmes was born evil. Others believe he was shaped by his childhood, filled with abuse, fear, and isolation. He was physically punished, emotionally neglected, and bullied. He learned early on that lying, manipulating, and hurting others gave him control. His early love for dissecting animals and obsession with anatomy only grew worse with time. What started with rabbits and frogs ended in human torture and murder. Holmes was a classic example of a psychopath, charming, manipulative, lacking guilt, and skilled at pretending to be someone he wasn't. He fooled landlords, doctors, business partners, and even police. For years, he got away with murder because people didn't believe someone so polite and well-spoken could be so cruel. H. Holmes was more than just a killer. He was a man who planned murder like a business, building an entire structure for the purpose of death. He preyed on trust and opportunity, using charm to get what he wanted, and destroying anyone in his way. His story is a disturbing reminder of how dangerous some people can be when they learn to hide behind a mask of politeness and success. Whether made by his upbringing or born with dark tendencies, Holmes remains one of the most chilling figures in American history. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Calm Stories. New true tales arrive often, softly told, always real. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay calm,